One bullet, prove it, or get off my base forever. Commander Cross slammed his hand on the table hard enough to knock over a steel water bottle. It hit the concrete floor like a gunshot. Every operator in the room flinched. Claire Mitchell did not move a single muscle. Cross walked toward her slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough that his voice dropped to something more dangerous than a shout. I don't care what those classified pages say. I don't care who signed your orders. 7 blacked-out pages don't make you a soldier. They make you a question mark. He pressed one finger against the target downrange. Answer the question. Before we go further, if you're watching this and something inside you already feels the fire rising, hit subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end, because what happened next didn't just shock the base, it changed every single person who was standing there that day. There is a kind of silence that only exists in military spaces. It's not the silence of peace. It's not the silence of rest. It's the silence that falls when an entire room of people who have survived combat, who have buried friends, who have trained their bodies past the point of human tolerance, when all of those people go completely still at the same time. That was the silence that fell over Naval Special Warfare Training Center, Coronado, California, on the morning that Captain Claire Mitchell arrived. She didn't arrive with noise. She didn't arrive with a reputation that walked in the door before her. She arrived alone with a single duffel bag over one shoulder, wearing her uniform with no visible decoration beyond what protocol required, and she signed her name at the front gate without saying a single unnecessary word to the officer who processed her credentials. The officer looked at her paperwork twice. Then he looked at her face. Then he looked at the paperwork again. Captain Mitchell, he said quietly, like he wasn't sure he should say the name out loud at all. Welcome to Coronado. She nodded once and walked through the gate. That was how the story began. Not with a fanfare, not with a ceremony, not with any of the dramatic arrivals that soldiers sometimes fantasize about when they imagine their moment of recognition finally coming. Just a woman, a bag, and a name on a piece of paper that made a seasoned gate officer check it twice. By the time she reached the barracks to check in with her commanding officer, 3 people had already made phone calls. Not about her orders, not about her assignment, about her record. Because Captain Claire Mitchell's service record was not a normal document. The first 12 pages were exactly what you would expect. Birth date, hometown, a small city in Ohio that nobody outside Ohio had ever heard of. Enlistment, basic training scores that were excellent without being theatrical. Early promotions that came steady and earned. Evaluations from commanders who used words like reliable and exceptional under pressure. An asset to any team she is assigned to. Standard language for a high-performing officer. But then you got to page 13. And page 13 was blacked out. Not partially, completely. Every line, every word, every date. Covered in the thick official black redaction ink that the military uses when a document contains information that cannot be released under any existing security clearance, below a threshold that most people in the room would never reach in their careers. And then page 14, same thing. Pages 15 through 22, same thing. 7 pages of a military service record that were so completely classified that even the people responsible for processing her assignment couldn't read them. And at the very top of page 23, where the redacted section ended and the readable text resumed, there was a single line, a single sentence. Typed in the standard military font, official and impersonal, and somehow, because of everything that came before it, the most terrifying sentence most people on that base had ever read in a personnel file. Operation Black Horizon, surviving personnel classified. Not personnel involved, not personnel assigned, surviving personnel. The word hung in the air over every conversation that happened on that base for the first 48 hours after Claire Mitchell walked through the gate. Surviving, as in there were others, as in something happened on that operation that required the military to classify not just the mission, but the human beings who came back from it. As in coming back was the part that needed to be kept secret. The rumors started the way rumors always start in military environments, quietly in corners, between people who trust each other enough to speak out loud about the things they're supposed to keep to themselves. Private First Class Rodriguez, who worked in the administrative building and had processed more personnel files than she could count, mentioned to a friend in the mess hall that she had never seen that many classified pages in a single record outside of the most senior intelligence officers she had ever processed. Her friend mentioned it to someone else. That someone else mentioned it to two more people. By the end of the second day, every enlisted soldier at Coronado knew three things about Captain Claire Mitchell. One, she was female, which meant she was part of the still recent wave of women who had broken into special operations roles, and which meant that roughly half the people on the base had already decided before meeting her that her presence was either a historic achievement or an administrative mistake with very little room for anything in between. Two, she had a classified record that nobody could read. Three, she was the only person who came back from Operation Black Horizon. Nobody knew what Operation Black Horizon was. Nobody had the clearance to find out. But the name alone did something to people. It had weight to it. The kind of weight that you feel in your chest before you can explain why. Black Horizon, like the edge of something you couldn't see past. The stories that formed around those three facts were everything you might expect from a community of elite soldiers who had spent their careers training their imaginations alongside their bodies. Some people said she was the best marksman the military had ever produced, that she had made a shot in the field that military scientists couldn't fully explain using standard ballistic models, that the classified pages contained the documentation of something so extraordinary that releasing it would change the way the military thought about human performance. Some people said the whole thing was political, that she had connections in Washington that her record didn't show, that the classified pages were blank, that the redactions covered nothing but air, and that the name Black Horizon was a piece of fiction designed to give a controversial promotion a heroic backstory. Some people said she was broken, that she had survived whatever happened on that operation because she was the only one who didn't fight, that the trauma had changed her in ways that weren't visible yet, but would eventually become the reason she wouldn't last at Coronado. And some people, a smaller number, but they existed, said nothing, because they had served long enough to know that the people who came back from the worst situations were rarely the people who were the loudest afterward. They waited, they watched, and they kept their opinions to themselves. Captain Claire Mitchell, for her part, seemed to be aware of none of it, or if she was aware, she gave no indication. She woke up at 5 in the morning like everyone else. She ran her miles, she ate in the mess hall, she attended briefings, she completed every administrative requirement associated with her new assignment with the same efficient, unhurried energy that she had used to sign her name at the front gate. She didn't seek out the people who were watching her, she didn't avoid them. She moved through the base like someone who had decided a long time ago that other people's opinions of her were not information she needed to function. It drove people absolutely insane. Because there is something deeply unsettling about a person who seems genuinely unbothered by being watched. In a military environment where reputation is currency and the way you carry yourself in your first weeks at a new assignment can define how people treat you for the rest of your career, most people perform. They perform confidence. They perform competence. They work very hard to make sure that the impression they leave is the impression they intended. Claire Mitchell didn't perform. She just existed. And the gap between her stillness and everyone else's noise was the thing that people couldn't stop talking about. It was on the 5th day that Commander Ethan Cross decided he had heard enough. Commander Cross was by any reasonable measure one of the most decorated and respected figures in the history of naval special warfare. 28 years of service, multiple combat deployments across 4 different theaters of operation, a record of training that had shaped some of the most effective special operations units in the modern American military. I was 61 years old, physically lean in the way that men who have never stopped moving their whole lives tend to be lean, with close-cropped gray hair, and a face that had the particular quality of faces that have spent a long time in direct sun and direct stress. His eyes were the pale, steady blue of someone who had looked at a great many things without flinching. He believed in one thing above everything else: proof, not reputation, not rumor, not credentials on paper. Proof in real time, under real pressure, against real difficulty. Han had built his entire career and his entire training philosophy on that single principle, because he had learned through decades of watching people perform and fail that the human capacity for self-deception was virtually unlimited. People could believe in their own abilities past the point where those abilities actually existed. They could convince themselves and others that they were capable of things they would collapse under the moment the conditions became real. And legend, in his experience, was the most dangerous form of self-deception. Because legend didn't live in the person who was legendary. It lived in the people around them. It lived in the way other people looked at you and spoke to you and made space for you and adjusted their own behavior based on what they believed you were capable of. And if you let a legend build around you, if you accepted the special treatment, the deference, the lowered expectations disguised as respect, you eventually forgot what you actually were without it. That was what he believed. That was the filter through which he read Claire Mitchell's arrival. And that was why on the fifth morning he arranged what happened next. He had chosen to do it in front of the entire unit, not privately, not in his office, not in a one-on-one evaluation session with controlled variables and reasonable expectations, in front of everyone. Because if the stories about her were true, she needed to demonstrate them in conditions that matched what the stories described, under observation, under pressure, with the full weight of other people's expectations and skepticism pressing down on her from every direction. And if the stories were not true, then everyone needed to see that too. He was not, in his own estimation, being cruel. He was being practical. He would think about that later when he understood what he had actually done. The training range at Coronado was a facility that most civilian shooters would consider science fiction. It was equipped with technology that didn't exist in public documentation, designed for exactly the kind of evaluation that Cross had in mind, the assessment of performance under conditions that pushed past what training normally produced into the territory where a person's actual limits became visible. When Claire arrived at the range that morning, she arrived at the same time as everyone else. She didn't know what was planned. She had received the same general briefing as the other personnel training exercise, advanced range qualification report, to the facility at OH 600. She walked in behind the Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, who she had spoken to exactly twice in 5 days, once in the mess hall, when she asked him to pass the coffee, and once in a briefing room when they had been assigned adjacent seats and had exchanged the minimal professional courtesies that the situation required. Webb was 6 feet 2 inches of deliberate, organized skepticism. He had been at Coronado for 4 years. He had trained under Cross personally, and he had made up his mind about Claire Mitchell on day 2. After someone showed him the section of her record they could read and asked him what he thought. What he thought was that exceptional performance in a classified operation that nobody could verify was not the same thing as proven performance in conditions that people could actually evaluate. He hadn't said that out loud exactly, but he thought it. He kept thinking it as they filed into the range. He was standing 3 feet to Claire's left when Commander Cross picked up the microphone. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has been trained to recognize a specific tone of voice that precedes something significant. Cross didn't waste any time. People in this unit, he said, his voice carrying across the range without effort, have been talking about Captain Mitchell since she arrived. Nobody moved. They've been talking about a mission they can't read about. They've been talking about a shot they've never seen. They've been talking about a legend that exists entirely on paper and in rumor, and in the spaces between the things they're not cleared to know. He paused. It was a very deliberate pause. Captain Mitchell. She turned to face him. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her face was, and this was the thing that the people who were watching her would remember later when they talked about this day, completely calm. Not the forced calm of someone working hard to suppress a reaction. The real calm of someone who was not particularly surprised by what was happening and had already decided how to respond to it. "Sir," she said, "people here are saying you made a shot that changed the outcome of a classified mission." The range was so quiet that you could hear the ventilation system. "Is that true?" She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, just long enough to make clear that she had heard the question, considered it, and chosen her answer deliberately rather than reflexively. "Sir," she said, "the mission report is classified." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I'm authorized to give." There it was. That was the moment that the room shifted. Because what she had just done, what she had just demonstrated in 4 seconds of quiet response, under the direct public pressure of the most respected man in the building, was something that most of the people watching her had spent years trying to learn how to do. She had not apologized. She had not become defensive. She had not explained herself or justified herself or appealed to anyone's sympathy or anger or sense of fairness. She had simply stated the truth of her position and held it, cleanly, without decoration. Commander Cross stepped forward. The gap between them was maybe 8 feet. "Let me be direct with you, Captain." "I'd appreciate that, sir. I have been training special operations personnel for nearly 30 years. In that time, I have seen a great many people arrive at facilities like this one with records that told impressive stories." He stopped walking. "Some of those people were everything their records suggested. Some of them were not. That's been my experience as well, sir." He blinked. It was a very small blink. But the people who were closest to him saw it, because Commander Ethan Cross was not accustomed to having his statements answered with that level of even agreement. Most people, when he began speaking to them in that tone, moved in one of two directions. They became smaller, or they became defensive. Either response was a kind of answer in itself. Claire had done neither. She had agreed with him, calmly, as though his 30 years of experience and her apparent classification were simply two data points in the same honest conversation, carrying roughly equal weight. "What I am saying," he continued, "is that I cannot evaluate what I cannot see. And what I have seen in your first 5 days in this unit is a person who is very good at not being seen. I haven't tried to be invisible, sir. No, you've been professional, competent, unremarkable." There was a slight fractional shift in her expression. Not hurt, not anger. Something more precise than either of those things. Like a person who had just been handed a test they had taken before and recognized it immediately. "Is that a problem?" she asked. "It's a limitation," Cross said. "In this unit, I need people I can evaluate. I need to know what they're capable of, what they're not capable of, and where exactly the line between those two things falls. I cannot know that about you based on what you've shown me in 5 days of standard operations. Then tell me what you need to see." He held her gaze for another moment, and then he said, "A shot, 1 bullet, a moving target, 940 meters. Standard wind conditions for this facility at the current hour, which my team tells me are 8 to 11 miles per hour with variable direction changes every 4 to 7 minutes. He let that land. Around them, the room had gone to a completely different quality of silence, the kind where people stop breathing at their normal rhythm. 940 meters, moving target, variable wind, 1 bullet. The math on that shot was not simple. The math on that shot for the majority of the people in that room, people who had trained their whole careers in precision shooting, placed it in a category they would describe honestly as extremely difficult. Not impossible technically, but the kind of shot where the difference between making it and missing it had as much to do with conditions and timing and a quality that experienced shooters sometimes called feel as it did with technical skill. And he was asking her to make it with no preparation time. 1 bullet, no second attempt, in front of the entire unit. Webb was watching her face. He had his arms crossed and he was watching her the way he watched everything. He was waiting to learn something from steadily, without expression, taking in every detail. He thought she would hesitate. I thought, and he would admit this later honestly because he was the kind of man who believed in honesty about his own failures, that the weight of what was being asked would produce some visible sign in her, a held breath, a tightening of the jaw, a glance around the room to gauge how many people were watching. Something. She gave him nothing. She looked at Cross for a moment after he finished speaking. Then she looked at the range. She took in the distance, the equipment, the indicators on the wind panels at the 300-meter mark and the 700-meter mark. She looked at the sky through the range's upper ventilation panels, reading the quality of light, the way experienced field operators learn to read it not for beauty, but for information. She looked back at Cross. Single shot, no prep, 940 moving, current wind conditions. She said, "What's the target frame?" He blinked again. "Standard IPSC silhouette, moving at 6 kilometers per hour, lateral movement left to right initiating on your command." She nodded once. "May I use the rifle I signed out this morning?" "It's already there," he said, and gestured toward the bench at the near end of the range. She walked to the bench without another word. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She didn't take her time in a way that suggested she was performing composure. She simply walked to the bench, picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, checked the mechanism, settled it against her shoulder once to feel the weight, and set it back down on the bench. Then she stood still for approximately 45 seconds, Webb would time it later because he became curious about it after the fact. 45 seconds of standing completely still behind a rifle at the bench of a firing range with 200 people watching her, and a legend she had never claimed on the line in a shot that the best technical shooters in the building had already mentally categorized as extremely difficult. 45 seconds. And in that 45 seconds, the thing that would stay with the people who watched her, the thing they would describe when they talked about this afterward over and over, trying to find the right words for it, was not her stillness. It was what her stillness communicated. Because there are different kinds of stillness. There is the stillness of someone who is frozen. There is the stillness of someone who is pretending. There is the stillness of someone who is conserving everything, every bit of energy, every fraction of attention, every tiny physical resource for the single moment that is coming. The people who had been in combat recognized the third kind. Not all of them recognized it in her right away. But the ones who had been in the worst situations, the situations where the difference between surviving and not surviving was measured in fractions of seconds, in the absolute uncompromising discipline of your own mind, those people recognized it. And a few of them, without quite realizing they were doing it, uncrossed their arms. Webb was one of them. He uncrossed his arms, and he waited. Claire picked up the rifle again. She moved through the process of positioning it with the kind of economy of motion that comes not from being taught to be efficient, but from having done something so many times that your body simply knows the shortest path between where you are and where you need to be. She settled the stock against her shoulder. She looked through the scope. Her breathing changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone more than 3 feet away could see, but it changed. It became longer, slower, more deliberate. The kind of breathing that is actually a form of concentration, a physical anchor for the mind to use when the mind is being asked to do something that requires it to be perfectly quiet. Commander Cross was standing 10 feet to her right. He was watching her, and something was happening in his chest that he had not expected to feel. I had designed this challenge as a test. He had brought her here to prove something or to disprove something. He had told himself that he was doing this for the integrity of the unit, for the standards that his 30 years had been built on, for the principle that legend and proof were not the same thing. But standing there watching her settle into that rifle with that particular quality of absolute concentrated presence, he felt something else rising alongside the intention he had arrived with. Not doubt, not exactly, more like the sensation of standing at the edge of a thing you thought you understood and beginning to wonder if you had misread the dimensions. He had challenged a great many soldiers. He had seen a great many responses to pressure. He could not recall in 30 years seeing anyone take 45 seconds to stand still before a shot and use those 45 seconds in that particular way. Like the entire world had gotten very small. Like the wind and the distance and the target and the watching eyes had all collapsed into a single point of information. Like she was not preparing to shoot. Like she had already shot in her mind and was simply waiting for her body to catch up. The target began to move. Someone had started the mechanism while Cross was still processing what he was seeing, and the silhouette at the 940-meter mark began its lateral traverse left to right, 6 kilometers per hour, exactly as specified, exactly as difficult as everyone in the room had understood it to be. Webb stopped breathing. He noticed this afterward. He couldn't tell you exactly when. He stopped only that at some point in the approximately 11 seconds between when the target started moving and when Claire Mitchell pulled the trigger. He had forgotten to breathe. He was not alone. Commander Ethan Cross, 28 years of combat deployment, 61 years of deliberate, disciplined attention to the world around him. Commander Cross had also stopped breathing. The range was so quiet that the sound of the ventilation system was the loudest thing in it. The wind indicator at the 300-meter mark shifted. Claire's breathing changed again. One beat, one breath. The rifle cracked. The sound split the silence with an absolute physical certainty, not loud in the way that ranges without acoustic management are loud but precise, definitive. The sound of a mechanical action completing itself in exactly the way it was designed to. For a moment, the range was exactly as quiet as it had been before. Then someone at the technical board said very quietly, "Oh, just that, oh," and Cross turned toward the results display. And the number was there, not close, not approximate. the dead center of the silhouette at 940 meters with a moving target in variable wind in one bullet and no preparation time and 200 people watching. Dead center. Webb reached for the edge of the bench next to him and put his hand on it. Not because he needed the support, because he needed to touch something solid. Because what he had just witnessed was the kind of thing that reorganizes the way you understand the possible, and reorganization of that kind has a physical quality to it, a feeling of the ground shifting slightly, gently under your feet in a way that doesn't knock you down, but reminds you that you are standing on something that could move. Cross walked toward the display, slowly. He walked the way he walked when he was thinking harder than his face was showing, which was to say he walked normally because his face never showed much, but something in the specific quality of his silence was different from the silence he arrived with. He looked at the result for a long moment. Then he turned. Claire had already set the rifle back on the bench. She was standing in the same posture she had held since she arrived, hands loose at her sides, face quiet, waiting without the energy of someone who was waiting. Cross walked back toward her. He stopped 4 feet away. The shot, he said, and then he stopped, because the sentence he had planned to say, the sentence that was supposed to follow the word shot, had been built on an assumption that was no longer accurate, and he was not a man who continued sentences built on false premises just because he had started them. He started again. That shot, he said. She looked at him. Was that the hardest part, he asked, of whatever it is you're not authorized to tell me about? She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. No, sir, she said. Then what was? And she said the thing that would stay with every person in that room for the rest of their careers. The thing that would be repeated in mess halls and briefing rooms and late-night conversations between soldiers who were trying to understand what they had witnessed. She said it quietly, without drama, without the tone of someone delivering a prepared statement or a practiced revelation. She said it like someone stating a simple fact that they had learned the hard way and had carried a long time. Convincing people that someone they underestimated, she said, was capable all along. Cross looked at her, 200 soldiers looked at her, and nobody said anything. Because every single person in that room, including the ones who had come there that morning, certain of what they believed about her, every single person understood that they had just been told the truth about themselves. Not by an accusation, not by an argument, by 6 words from a woman who had spent 5 days walking quietly through their base while they decided in advance what she was. Webb took his hand off the bench. He stood up straight, and he did something he would not have predicted himself doing that morning. He began to clap, once, twice, and then someone else joined him, and then someone else. Commander Cross didn't clap. He stood very still in front of Captain Claire Mitchell, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just been taught something he did not expect to be taught. And then he did something he had done fewer than 10 times in 30 years of service. He extended his hand. She shook it, and the silence that fell after the applause was different from every other silence that morning. It was the silence of a room that had changed, of people who had walked in carrying one understanding of the world and were walking out carrying a different one. And at the center of it, holding nothing, no rifle, no proof, no triumph. In her expression was Captain Claire Mitchell, who had known from the moment she walked through the gate 5 days ago that this was coming, who had never announced herself, who had never tried to correct the rumors or silence the skeptics or defend the record that nobody could read, who had simply waited for the moment when the truth would be the only thing left standing. She had been right, and the cost of being right, the cost of carrying a classified history in 7 blacked-out pages, in the weight of names that couldn't be spoken, in a mission that could never be fully explained, that cost was still there. It would always be there, but something else was there now too. 200 soldiers, some of them with their arms uncrossed for the first time all morning, some of them already beginning to understand that the question they should have been asking wasn't whether she deserved to be there. The question they should have been asking was what she could teach them. And Commander Ethan Cross, standing 4 feet away from her, with his hand still carrying the memory of her handshake, was just beginning to ask himself the same thing. He didn't know the answer yet, but he was already certain of one thing. The soldier standing in front of him had survived something that no piece of paper, classified or otherwise, could fully describe. And whatever it was, whatever had happened on the other side of those 7 blacked out pages in the dark of Operation Black Horizon, in the place where surviving was the part that needed to be kept secret, whatever it was had built the person she was now. And the person she was now had just changed the standard for what the best looked like. Cross looked at her one more time. "At ease, Captain," he said quietly. She nodded once. The same single nod she had given the gate officer 5 days ago. And then she walked off the range the same way she had walked onto it, without ceremony, without announcement, like a person who had finished a task that needed doing and was ready for the next one. The 200 soldiers watched her go, and the conversation that had been filling the spaces of that base for 5 days, the rumors, the theories, the skepticism, the stories, all of it fell completely silent, because there was nothing left to say about what she might be. They had just seen what she was. Nobody left the range immediately after Claire walked off. That was the first unusual thing. In a normal training environment, the moment a demonstration ends, people move. They check their phones, they talk to the person next to them. They begin processing what they saw by converting it immediately into conversation, because conversation is how soldiers deal with things they don't fully understand yet. Nobody moved, not for almost 90 seconds. Webb counted. He didn't plan to count. His mind just started doing it automatically the way trained minds do when they are trying to anchor themselves in something measurable because everything else in the moment feels unmeasurable. 90 seconds of 200 people standing exactly where they were looking at the space Claire Mitchell had just vacated, like they were waiting for the image of her to finish dissolving before they trusted themselves to speak. Commander Cross broke it. He turned away from the range display and he walked back toward the center of the floor and he said it in a voice that was completely level, "Dismissed." Just that, dismissed. No commentary, no assessment, no framing of what had just happened in a way that gave people permission to categorize it. Just dismissed. And people began to move. But the conversations that started as they moved, the conversations that broke out in clusters of 2 and 3, as people filed out of the range and into the corridor, and eventually into the open air of the base, those conversations were not the conversations that anyone had expected to be having when they woke up that morning. Webb fell into step beside a man named Sergeant First Class Danny Kowalski, who had been standing 3 rows behind them and who had, for the record, been one of the louder voices in the mess hall 2 days ago, when the conversation about Claire's record had reached its peak volume. Kowalski had said specifically that a classified record was the military's way of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves in public scrutiny. I had said it with the particular confidence of someone who believed they were stating an obvious truth that other people were too polite to voice. Webb looked at him now as they walked. Kowalski was quiet. Webb waited. "Don't say it," Kowalski said finally. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." "I was going to ask if you wanted coffee," Webb said. "But sure." Kowalski stopped walking. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, and 2 people behind him had to adjust their path to go around him. And he didn't notice because he was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who is running a very uncomfortable internal calculation. 940 meters, he said. "Moving target," Webb added. "Variable wind." "1 bullet." Kowalski looked up. "I've been shooting for 11 years. "I know." "I wouldn't have taken that shot." Webb looked at him. "I know that too." They stood there for a moment. Around them, the corridor was filling with people and noise, and the particular energy of a large group of humans trying to process something collectively without admitting they were doing it collectively. "What happened over there?" Kowalski said. "On Black Horizon. What do you think actually happened?" "I think," Webb said carefully, "that whatever happened, she came back from it. And I think the people who didn't come back from it are the reason she doesn't talk about it." Kowalski absorbed that. He started walking again. He didn't say anything else for a long time. But Webb noticed in the mess hall an hour later that Kowalski had moved his tray to a table closer to where Claire was sitting. Not next to her, not in a way that could be interpreted as deliberate, but closer, like someone adjusting their position without fully admitting they were adjusting it. Claire, for her part, was eating breakfast with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. A cup of coffee black, eggs, toast, a copy of a maintenance report she was reading while she ate because she had been assigned to review facility equipment evaluations as part of her first week's administrative duties, and she was doing that duty the same way she did everything else, without drama. without any visible awareness that the entire mess hall was quietly, collectively trying to figure out how to exist in the same room as her now. It was Specialist First Class Ana Reyes who made the first move. Reyes was 26 years old and had been at Coronado for 8 months. She was small, precise, with a mind that processed information faster than most people in the room, and an absolute zero tolerance for what she privately called performed deference, the specific behavior of people who acted respectful towards someone because they felt obligated to, rather than because they actually felt it. She had watched Claire in the range that morning with the particular attention of someone who was not watching the shot. She was watching Claire's face during the 45 seconds of stillness before the shot. And what she saw in those 45 seconds was something she had been trying to find a language for since it happened, because the language kept coming up slightly insufficient. She picked up her tray, walked across the mess hall, and sat down directly across from Claire. Claire looked up from the maintenance report. "Morning," Reyes said. "Morning," Claire said. "I'm Reyes, Ana Reyes. We haven't officially met." "I know who you are," Claire said. "You scored top on the last 3 equipment qualification reviews. Your range scores for the past 2 quarters have been consistently in the 94th percentile, Speechles." Reyes blinked. "You read the personnel files. Administrative review is part of my assignment this week," Claire said. "I read everyone's." There was a pause. "You read everyone's files," Reyes repeated slowly, "before anyone in this unit had officially introduced themselves to you." "I like to know who I'm working with," Claire said. She picked up her coffee. It seemed more efficient than waiting for introductions. Reyes stared at her for a moment. Then she did something that surprised both of them. She laughed. Not politely, not the careful social laugh of someone trying to establish rapport. A real laugh, short and sharp and genuine, the kind that escapes before you have a chance to decide whether or not you meant to let it out. "Okay," Reyes said. "Okay, I have a question." "You can ask it." "The 45 seconds." Claire set down her coffee. "Before you took the shot," Reyes said, "you stood completely still for 45 seconds. I timed it. Everyone else was watching the range or watching cross or watching the wind indicators. I was watching you. What's your question? What were you doing in those 45 seconds? What was actually happening inside your head?" Claire was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't want to answer. The quiet of someone finding the most accurate way to say something that didn't have a simple answer. "I was listening," she said. "To what?" "To everything that was trying to make me miss." Reyes leaned forward slightly. "Such as?" 200 people watching," Claire said. "Cross-standing 10 feet away, 11 years of stories about me that I never told. The knowledge that if I missed every person in that room, would have a story confirmed that they had already decided to believe." She paused. "And the wind?" "The wind was last on the list," Reyes said. "The wind was the only thing on the list that was actually relevant to the shot," Claire said. "Everything else was just noise. The 45 seconds was how long it took me to convince my nervous system that the noise wasn't data." Reyes sat back. She was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "How do you learn to do that?" she said finally. "How do you learn to separate the noise from the data when everything happening around you feels like data?" Claire looked at her steadily. "You go somewhere where the cost of getting it wrong is high enough that your brain stops having the option of treating the noise as data," she said. "And then you come back." She picked up her maintenance report again. Reyes understood that the conversation had reached its natural boundary. She didn't push past it. She picked up her fork and started eating, and they sat in a companionable silence that felt oddly like the most honest exchange Reyes had had in months. Across the mess hall, Commander Cross was not eating. He was standing at the entrance to the hall holding a coffee he hadn't drunk, watching the interaction between Reyes and Claire with the focused attention of a man doing a rapid and thorough reassessment of a situation he had misread. He had been misreading it since day one. He understood that now. The thing that troubled him, the thing that had been sitting in the back of his chest since the moment Claire answered his challenge with 1 bullet and 4 seconds of silence, and then said the truest thing anyone had said to him in years, was not that he had been wrong about her capability. He had been wrong about her capability. That was simply factual. He had assumed limits that did not exist based on assumptions that had nothing to do with the evidence in front of him and everything to do with patterns He had calcified into certainties over 30 years of experience. But that wasn't what was troubling him. What was troubling him was that he had done it publicly. He had chosen deliberately with intention, in front of 200 people, to make her prove herself in the most exposed and pressurized conditions he could construct. And he had told himself it was for the integrity of the unit. He was standing in the mess hall doorway, understanding with the particular discomfort of a disciplined mind confronting its own dishonesty that it was not entirely for the integrity of the unit. It was because she made him uncomfortable, not her presence, not her gender, not her classified record, her stillness, the way she moved through a space without performing for it, the way she answered questions with the minimum number of words required to answer them accurately, the way she seemed from the first moment she walked through the gate to be completely at peace with not being legible to the people around her. That kind of stillness in his experience came from one of two places, either profound indifference or profound clarity. Indifference was a liability in a special operations environment. He had seen it before. Soldiers who had been through so much that they had stopped connecting to the things around them. They moved through operations efficiently, technically, and without the emotional investment that made good soldiers great. Clarity was different. Clarity was the rarest thing he had ever seen. He had met maybe 4 people in 30 years who had it. The kind of clarity that didn't come from training, that couldn't be taught in any program he had ever designed, that existed only in people who had gone to a place where everything unnecessary had been stripped away and come back knowing with absolute precision what mattered and what didn't. He had looked at Claire's stillness and categorized it as indifference. He understood now that he had been wrong. He drank his coffee finally. It was cold. He drank it anyway because the discomfort felt appropriate. Then he walked back to his office and pulled up the portion of her record that he could access. He had read it before on day one. He had noted the redacted pages, the classified operation, the standard language of the evaluations that preceded it. He had formed his impressions and set the file aside. Now he read it differently. He read it as a document about a person rather than a document about a record. He paid attention not just to what was there, but to the way it was structured, the way the language in her evaluations shifted subtly over time, the way the descriptions of her performance changed character between her first assignment and her most recent ones. Early evaluations used words like capable and diligent, good soldier words, the words you use for someone who was doing their job well. The evaluations from the 18 months before the classified section used different words. Decisive under extreme pressure, demonstrated ability to maintain operational coherence when command structure was disrupted, consistently prioritized mission and team integrity over personal safety, exhibits a quality of judgment that is not developed by training alone. That last phrase, not developed by training alone, cross that with that. He had spent 30 years designing training programs. He believed with the conviction of someone who had built a career on that belief that the right training applied rigorously enough could develop almost any quality in a soldier, not developed by training alone. Whoever wrote that evaluation had seen something in her that they believed training couldn't explain. He turned to the page that preceded the classified section, the last readable entry before the black ink started. It was a standard post-deployment psychological evaluation. The language was clinical and impersonal in the way that military psychological documentation always was. But the final paragraph had one sentence that he read 3 times. Captain Mitchell demonstrates a level of psychological integration following the reported events that is, in the evaluating professional's opinion, exceptional rather than typical and suggestive of a depth of internal resource that merits further study. Psychological integration following the reported events. He didn't know what the reported events were. Nobody at his clearance level did. But psychological integration was a specific clinical term. It referred to the process by which a person incorporated traumatic experience into their ongoing sense of self, not suppressing it, not being overwhelmed by it, but genuinely absorbing it in a way that changed who they were without destroying who they were. Most people who went through serious trauma did not integrate it. They managed it. They coped with it. They developed strategies for functioning in the presence of it. Integration was different. Integration meant the experience became part of the person in a way that made them more rather than less. The psychological evaluator who wrote that final sentence was saying in the restrained language of professional documentation that Claire Mitchell had done something with whatever happened to her on Black Horizon that most people who went through comparable experiences did not manage to do. She had made it part of herself and come out the other side of it carrying something that couldn't be built in a training facility. Cross closed the file. He sat at his desk for a long time. Outside his window, he could hear the sounds of the bass resuming its normal rhythm, vehicles moving, voices carrying across the open areas, the distant crack of activity from the range where afternoon training was beginning. Normal sounds, the sounds of a place that had this morning been changed by something that shouldn't have been possible to change it. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hendricks, his direct superior, who oversaw the Special Operations Training Division, and who had without any ceremony assigned Claire to his unit 3 weeks ago without an explanation that satisfied him. Hendricks picked up on the second ring. "Cross," she said, not a greeting, a statement of fact, the way she always answered when she saw his name on the screen. "You knew," he said. A pause. "I knew what?" "You knew what was in those classified pages. Or enough of it. You knew what she was before you assigned her here." Another pause. Longer this time. "I knew enough," Hendricks said. "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because," Hendricks said, and her voice had the particular quality it got when she was saying something she had thought about carefully before the conversation began. "If I had told you what I knew about her, you would have formed an impression before you met her. And the impression you formed would have been exactly as incomplete as the impression that you formed without the information, just in a different direction." Cross was quiet. "I needed you to see her," Hendricks said. "Not the record, not the classification, not what I knew or what Washington knew or what anyone who had read the full file knew. I needed you to see her." "You were using my skepticism as a test," he said. "I was using your skepticism as the most accurate possible lens," she said. "You don't give people credit they haven't earned. You don't defer to authority you don't trust. If Claire Mitchell could establish herself in your unit under your direct scrutiny, with your full skepticism applied to her every day, then she had established herself. No questions, no asterisks." He let out a breath. "She made the shot," he said. "I heard," Hendricks said, and her voice for the first time in the conversation carried something that wasn't professional composure. Something quieter and more genuine. "I always believed she would." She said something afterward. What did she say? He repeated it. The 6 words. The sentence that had been sitting in his chest since the moment she said it. Hendricks was silent for a moment. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly who she is." "I want the full file," Cross said. "You don't have the clearance. Then I want whatever you can give me." Hendricks paused. "I can give you one thing," she said. "One thing that isn't in the redacted section. One thing from a debrief that I was present for." "Tell me." "When they brought her back from Black Horizon," Hendricks said, "the debrief team asked her the standard question. They ask it of everyone who comes back from a high-casualty operation. They asked her what kept you functional when everything else collapsed." Cross waited. "She said the people who were counting on me weren't there anymore, so I had to count on myself for them." The line was quiet. "She was carrying them," Cross said. "She's been carrying them since," Hendricks said. "Every day, every qualification, every evaluation, every shot she takes. She's carrying 6 people who can't carry anything anymore, and she is trying to make that mean something." Cross didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. I understood now why she didn't talk about her record. He understood why she didn't defend herself against the rumors, or correct the skeptics, or claim the credit that the base had been debating her right to for 5 days. She wasn't trying to prove she was good enough. She was trying to make their lives worth the cost of hers. He sat at his desk for a long time after he hung up. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and a pen, and he began to write. Not a report, not an official document, just thoughts in the handwriting that his mother had once told him looked like a doctor's, and that had never improved despite multiple attempts. He wrote at the top of the page what I got wrong, and then he started making the list. He assumed her stillness was performance. It was integration. He assumed her silence was defensiveness. It was discipline. He assumed her classified record was a liability. It was the document of a cost she had already paid. He assumed her presence in his unit was a political decision. It was a considered judgment by someone who understood what the unit needed better than he did. He assumed he was testing her. He had been testing himself. He set down the pen and looked at the list. 4 lines, 4 ways he had been wrong about a person in 5 days. I had made errors of judgment before. Every person who spent 30 years making consequential decisions made errors. He knew that. He had accepted it as part of the nature of operating in conditions where perfect information was never available. But this error was different, because this error was not the result of insufficient information. He had had information. He had had 5 days of watching her. He had had the behavior, the posture, the way she answered questions, the way she moved through the base, all of it visible, all of it available, none of it requiring clearance. And he had ignored all of it because he had already decided. He had decided before he watched her. He had decided before he designed the challenge on the range. He had decided at some point in the first 48 hours after she arrived that the most likely explanation for Captain Claire Mitchell was the one that required her to be less than what her record suggested, and he needed to understand why. It was an honest question, a serious one. He sat with it, and the answer that came back was the one he least wanted, because the answer was not complicated. The answer was that he had never in 30 years been challenged by someone who looked the way she looked, moved the way she moved, carried herself the way she carried herself. His entire framework for identifying exceptional operators had been built on patterns, patterns of behavior, patterns of communication, patterns of response under pressure that he had assembled over 30 years of watching a specific kind of person in a specific kind of environment. Claire Mitchell didn't match the patterns. And when someone didn't match the patterns, his first assumption was that they were less than the patterns required. Not that the patterns were incomplete. I was 61 years old, and he was sitting at his desk writing a list of the ways he had been wrong, and he was understanding with the particular quality of understanding that arrives when it is both too late and exactly on time, that the most dangerous thing about expertise was not the things it helped you see. It was the things it trained you to stop looking for. He folded the legal pad in half and put it in his desk drawer. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and walked back out of his office, because there was something he needed to do. Webb was in the equipment room when Cross found him running a maintenance check on a set of communications gear, with the methodical attention that made him good at his job. He looked up when Cross came in, and his expression did the thing it always did when he saw his commanding officer unexpectedly, a rapid professional shift from focused to attentive. "Sir?" "At ease," Cross said. He looked around the room. They were alone. "I want to ask you something." "Sir, when she was standing at the bench this morning, before the shot, what did you see?" Webb was quiet for a moment. He set down the equipment he was holding and gave the question the kind of attention it deserved. "I saw someone who had already made peace with the outcome," Webb said, "before the outcome happened." "Explain that." "Most people before a high-stakes shot are fighting their own fear of missing. You can see it. Even the best shooters, there's this moment just before they fire where you can see them arguing with the possibility of failure, trying to push it out, trying to replace it with confidence or focus or whatever they've been trained to use." He paused. "She wasn't fighting anything," Webb said. "She had already decided that whatever happened was going to happen, and she had accepted it, and then she shot. Like the accepting was the actual skill. The shot was just what came after." Cross looked at him. "You've seen that before?" he asked. Webb shook his head slowly. "No, sir," he said. "I've heard about it. I've read about it. I've had instructors describe it as the thing you spend a career trying to get to." He picked up the equipment again. "I didn't think I'd see it from someone who'd been on the base 5 days." Cross nodded. He turned to leave. "Sir," Webb said. Cross stopped. "What she said afterward. The thing about underestimating. What about it?" "She wasn't talking about you," Webb said. "I mean, she was, but she wasn't only talking about you." He paused. "I think she's been saying that to herself for a long time. About herself, about what she could be, about whether she had the right to keep going after Black Horizon." He set down the equipment again more carefully this time. "I think that shot was for us, but I think it was for them too." Cross was very still. "The team," he said. "Yes, sir." The equipment room was quiet. "Thank you, Sergeant," Cross said. He walked out, and down the corridor and back out into the open air of the base, and he stood there for a moment with the sun hitting his face and the sounds of Coronado moving around him, and he thought about 6 people whose names he didn't know who had gone somewhere he couldn't read about and hadn't come back, and about the woman who had, and about the 45 seconds of silence she carried with her every time she stood at a line and asked herself whether she was enough to carry what they left behind. She was enough, he knew that now. The only question remaining was what he was going to do with what he knew. He turned back toward the administrative building, because he had a program to redesign, and he needed to start immediately. The program redesign took Cross 3 days to draft, not because the ideas were slow in coming. The ideas came faster than they had in years, with the particular energy of someone who had just had a belief system cracked open and was finding that the light coming through the crack was more useful than the solid wall had ever been. The ideas came fast, but the honesty required to write them down correctly took 3 days. Because what Cross was trying to build wasn't just a new training curriculum. He was trying to build something that accounted for a gap he had spent 30 years not seeing. And writing honestly about a gap you spent 30 years not seeing requires a specific kind of discipline that is harder than any physical training he had ever designed. He called it in the working draft decision architecture under cascading pressure. The official name would come later. For now, it was just the yellow legal pad, the handwriting his mother would have criticized, and the slow, careful work of translating what he had witnessed on that range into something that could be taught. On the second day of the draft, he walked to the range at 1400 hours and found Claire already there. She wasn't shooting. She was sitting on the bench at the far end of the facility with a notebook open on her knee, writing something with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything. She didn't look up when he came in, which told him she had heard him and made a deliberate choice not to interrupt what she was doing. He respected that. He sat down on the bench 12 feet away and didn't say anything either. They stayed like that for almost 4 minutes. 2 people in a large, quiet facility doing their separate work in the same space without the performance of acknowledging each other that most social situations demanded. It was Claire who spoke first. "You're redesigning the program," she said. She didn't look up from the notebook. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Ray just told me you requisitioned 3 whiteboards from the storage unit and a complete set of the existing curriculum documentation." She turned a page. "You only do that when you're building something from scratch." "Reyes has been talking to you?" "Reyes talks to everyone," Claire said. "She's the most socially efficient person in this unit. She gathers more accurate information in a casual conversation than most intelligence analysts get from a formal debrief." She finally looked up. "You should pay attention to that." Cross looked at her for a moment. "Is that a recommendation?" "It's an observation," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." He almost smiled. He didn't quite, but the muscles in his face moved in that direction. "The program," he said. "I want to talk to you about it." She closed the notebook. Not quickly, not with any dramatic signal of attention. Just a clean, simple action that said she was ready to listen. "I've been running decision-making training for 11 years, Cross said. "The existing curriculum covers stress inoculation, decision fatigue, command hierarchy under pressure, communication breakdown scenarios. It's a good program." "It is," Claire said, "but it's missing something." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "You know what it's missing?" It wasn't a question. "I have a theory," she said. "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, organizing. "Every scenario in the existing curriculum has a correct answer," she said. "Not always obvious, not always easy to reach, but there. Somewhere in the structure of every training scenario is a solution that the designers already know. And soldiers know that, even when they're under stress, even when the scenario is designed to feel chaotic. Some part of their mind knows that the people who built this exercise have already identified the right move. And that knowledge, that background certainty that a solution exists and has been pre-approved changes the quality of the decision-making." Cross was very still, because in the field, he said slowly, "in the field," she said, "there are situations where there is no pre-approved solution, where the people who designed your training didn't anticipate the specific combination of variables you're facing, where you have to make a decision, not because you can identify the correct answer, but because making any decision is better than making none, and the cost of hesitation is measured in people." She looked at him directly. "The program trains people to find the answer," she said. It doesn't train them for what happens when there isn't one. Cross sat with that for a long moment. Outside the range, he could hear the afternoon training beginning on the adjacent facility. Voices, equipment, the organized noise of people in motion. Black horizon, he said. He said it quietly. Not as a question, not as a probe, just as a statement of where his thinking had arrived. Claire's expression didn't change. I'm not asking about the operation, he said quickly. I'm not asking about anything classified. I'm asking about the decision-making, abstractly. She held his gaze for a moment. There was a moment, she said, when I had to make a decision that had no correct answer. The situation had moved past the edge of any training scenario I had ever run. Every option in front of me had a cost that was unacceptable, and I had about 4 seconds to choose which unacceptable cost I was willing to pay. The range was very quiet. What did you do? Cross asked. I chose, she said simply. That's all. I stopped looking for the option that wasn't there, and I chose between the options that were. In the 45 seconds on the range, Cross said, that was the same thing. The shot was never the hard part, she said. And this time, hearing it in private rather than in front of 200 people, it landed differently. Heavier, more specific. The hard part was choosing to believe I could make it when every piece of external evidence suggested I probably shouldn't try. When 200 people were standing there waiting for me to confirm what they already thought, when the easiest thing I could have done was hesitate long enough to give myself an excuse. The 45 seconds was you refusing the excuse, Cross said. The 45 seconds was me remembering why excuses weren't available to me anymore, she said. She picked up her notebook again, and Cross understood that was the end of what she was going to say about it. Not because she was done with him, but because she had given him what she could give him, and the rest of it lived in a place that classified ink existed to protect. He stood up. I want you involved in the redesign, he said. She looked up. Not as a subject, he said firmly. Not as a case study, as a designer. I want your framework for what the program is missing, built into the new curriculum from the ground up. She was quiet for a moment. That's a significant change to how this unit operates, she said. Yes. Some people will object. Some people objected to you being here at all, Cross said. Their track record on objections isn't strong this week. This time, she almost smiled. Almost. I'll need access to the existing curriculum documentation, she said. Reyes already knows where it is, Cross said. She'll have it to you by 1700. He walked toward the exit. Sir, Claire said. He stopped. The 45 seconds, she said. I need you to understand something about it. He turned back. It wasn't peace, she said. What you saw, what everyone saw, it wasn't peace, and it wasn't confidence, and it wasn't certainty about the outcome. She held his gaze steadily. It was grief, she said. Every time I shoot, I'm standing in front of that moment again. The moment on black horizon when I had to choose. And the 45 seconds is the time it takes of me to remind myself that they would want me to make the shot. Cross didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. He nodded once and walked out. He stood outside the range for a moment in the afternoon air, and he did something he rarely allowed himself to do during duty hours. He stopped moving, just for a moment, just long enough to let the weight of what she had just said settle fully into him before he picked it up and carried it forward. Then he walked back to his office, and the program redesign when he returned to it looked completely different from how it had looked that morning. Because he was no longer writing a curriculum. He was writing a tribute. He just didn't know it yet. The news that Cross was redesigning the program traveled through the base with a speed that surprised nobody who understood how military information moved. By the following morning, 1700 hours the previous day had become the unofficial timestamp for when everything changed with Reyes as the primary distribution node for accurate information and approximately a dozen other people filling in the gaps with varying degrees of accuracy. What was accurate, Cross was rebuilding the decision-making curriculum. Claire was involved. 3 whiteboards. What was less accurate, various versions of what this meant for the unit ranging from the reasonable to the dramatic, with Kowalski contributing a theory in the mess hall that was thoughtful enough that 2 people stopped eating to listen to it. He's not just changing the training, Kowalski said, cutting his eggs with more force than the eggs required. He's changing what we're optimizing for. Right now, the whole program optimizes for speed and accuracy under stress, which is right, which is what we need. But what she did on that range wasn't speed and accuracy. What was it? Said the soldier across from him, a quieter man named Tron, who listened more than he spoke and was generally considered by those who paid attention to be one of the sharpest analytical minds in the unit. It was acceptance, Kowalski said. She accepted the uncertainty of the outcome before she engaged with it, and that freed up processing power that the rest of us are spending on fighting the uncertainty. He pushed his eggs around. I've been doing this for 11 years, and I have never not once walked into a high-stakes situation and accepted the uncertainty before I engaged. I've managed it, I've suppressed it, I've trained through it. But not accepted it, Tran said. Not accepted it, Kowalski confirmed. Tran was quiet for a moment. You think that's teachable? Kowalski looked up. I think that's the question Cross is trying to answer. Across the mess hall, Reyes was listening to this conversation while appearing to be focused entirely on her coffee and a maintenance schedule. She had a particular gift for this, the ability to be present in a conversation without being visible in it, that she had cultivated since childhood, and that had become one of her most operationally useful qualities. She filed Kowalski's analysis under accurate and useful and moved on. What she was actually thinking about was the conversation she'd had with Claire the previous evening after Cross left the range. She had gone back to find Claire still there, still with the notebook, writing in the particular concentrated way that meant she was working through something rather than documenting something already known. Reyes had sat down without asking. Claire had not objected. They had worked in silence for a while, Reyes with her own documentation, Claire with whatever lived in that notebook, and then Reyes had asked the things she had been building toward since their conversation in the mess hall. The team, she said, from Black Horizon. Claire's pen stopped moving. You don't have to tell me anything classified, Reyes said quickly. I know, Claire said. I just want to know, were they like you the way you operate, the way you process things? Were they cut from the same cloth, or were you all different? Claire was quiet for a long time, long enough that Reyes began to think she wasn't going to answer. Then Claire said, Torres was the loudest person I have ever met. He laughed at everything, completely inappropriate timing, completely genuine every single time. Breckenridge barely spoke, but when she did, every person in the room stopped what they were doing because she was almost never wrong. Okafor was 24 years old, and he had already developed a philosophy about risk management that most people spend careers not arriving at. She paused. Park made coffee like it was sacred. Like the quality of the coffee was a moral statement about who he was as a soldier. I used to give him a hard time about it. She stopped. Reyes didn't say anything. Vasquez and Kim, Claire said. Her voice didn't break. It stayed completely level. But something happened to the quality of it, like a sound that was the same pitch but a different texture. Vasquez had 3 kids. Kim was 6 weeks from his end of service date. He had a job waiting for him. Something with an engineering firm in Seattle. He used to talk about Seattle like it was a different planet. Like the distance between where we were and Seattle was not just geographic. Reyes was very still. I was the only one who came back, Claire said. Not because I was the best of them. I want to be very clear about that. I was not the best of them. I came back because of a combination of position timing and a decision that cost them and benefited me in ways that I will spend the rest of my life trying to justify. The decision you can't talk about, Reyes said. The decision that is classified, Claire said. Yes, but you live with it. Every day, Claire said simply. Every qualification, every evaluation. Every morning at 5 when the alarm goes off and I decide whether today is the day I stop trying to be worth what it cost. She looked at Reyes directly. It has never been that day, but I check. Reyes sat with that for a long moment. That's why the 45 seconds, she said quietly. You're not just controlling your mind, you're reporting in. Claire looked at her. To them, Reyes said, you're telling them you're still here. You're still trying. You haven't stopped. Something moved across Claire's face. It was brief, very brief. But it was real, a flicker of something that was not composure, that was not discipline, that was purely and unmistakably human in the way that grief always is when it surfaces in someone who has worked very hard to keep it below the surface. Reyes, she said, yes, you are very good at this. Reyes almost smiled. At what? At finding the true thing inside the stated thing. Intelligence analyst background, Reyes said, before special operations. I spent 3 years learning to hear what people meant rather than what they said. It shows, Claire said. She picked up her pen. Stay, she said. Not a request, not quite a command, something in between. Reyes stayed. And for the next 2 hours, Claire talked through the framework she was building for the curriculum redesign, and Reyes listened and questioned and pushed back in the places where the framework had gaps. And by the end of the evening, they had something that was better than what either of them would have produced alone. It was the first time since she arrived at Coronado that Claire Mitchell had worked on anything collaboratively. Reyes noticed that. She didn't say it out loud, but she noticed. The next morning, Kowalski found Webb in the equipment room and told him what Reyes had told him about the previous evening's work session. Webb listened without interrupting, which was his practice, and when Kowalski finished, Webb said, "She's building something. The curriculum redesign." "Not just the curriculum," Webb said. He set down the equipment he was holding. "She came here classified. She came here with a record nobody could read and a reputation nobody could verify. And Cross challenged her in front of the whole unit, and she made the shot, and she could have stopped there. She had proven what needed to be proved. But she didn't stop," Kowalski said. "She started," Webb said. "The shot was the beginning. The 45 seconds, the things she said to Cross, the conversation with Reyes, the curriculum work, it's all connected. She's not just surviving here. She's building something." Kowalski looked at him. "What is she building?" Webb picked up the equipment again. "I think she's building a reason." "A reason for what?" "For why she's the one who came back." The equipment room went quiet. Kowalski stood there with that for a moment. Then he said quietly, "We've been treating her like she's here to prove herself to us." "Yes," Webb said, "but she's been here to prove something to herself." "Since day one," Webb said. "We just couldn't see it because we were too busy deciding what we already thought." Kowalski left the equipment room and walked down the corridor and stopped at the water station and stood there for a full minute without drinking anything. "I was thinking about Torres and Breckenridge and Okafor and Park and Vasquez and Kim, whose names he didn't know yet, whose faces he had never seen, who had gone somewhere classified and not come back. He was thinking about the woman who had come back in their place, and he was thinking about 11 years of his own career and the decisions he had made under pressure and the moments where he had felt the uncertainty rising and chosen to fight it rather than accept it, and what it might have cost him without his knowing. He filled his water bottle, and then he walked to the administrative building and knocked on the door of the room where Claire and Reyes were working on the curriculum redesign. Claire looked up. "I want to help," Kowalski said, "if you'll have me." A pause. "Pull up a chair," Claire said. He did. And what happened in that room over the next 72 hours was the kind of work that people who have been through it describe the same way every time. Regardless of what field they were in when it happened, the kind of work where time moves differently, where the division between people who were strangers a week ago dissolves into the specific shared intensity of building something together, where someone says a thing they didn't plan to say, and it opens a door that changes the direction of everything after it. On the first day, they worked through the structural gaps in the existing curriculum. Claire drove the frame. Reyes interrogated it. Kowalski contributed the practitioner perspective, the translation of theory, into what things actually felt like at ground level when the training ended and the reality started. On the second day, Cross came in for 3 hours. He sat at the corner of the table and listened more than he spoke, which was unusual for him, and which the three of them noticed without commenting on. When he did speak, what he said was precise and operational and genuinely useful, which told them that the 3 days he had spent rebuilding his own understanding had been productive. At one point during a discussion about how to design scenarios that had no pre-approved correct answer, Cross said something that stopped the room. "The hardest thing to teach," he said, "is not the decision. The hardest thing to teach is permission. Permission to decide in the absence of certainty. Because most of what we do in trainings build certainty. We build it deliberately because certainty under pressure is a valuable operational resource. But when we build so much certainty that soldiers stop knowing how to function without it, we've created a liability." He paused. "We've been training people to be certain," he said. "We need to train them to be clear." The room was quiet. "What's the difference?" Kowalski asked. Cross looked at Claire. Claire said, "Certainty is knowing the answer. Clarity is knowing yourself well enough to act without it." Cross nodded. "That," he said, "is the new standard." On the third day, something happened that nobody planned. Webb came in at OH 700 to drop off documentation that Cross had requested and found the room already occupied. Claire Reyes Kowalski and three other soldiers who had apparently been recruited over the previous evening, none of whom Webb had expected to see there. One of them was Tran, which didn't surprise him. One of them was a soldier named Ferrero, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics during the first 5 days of Claire's arrival, and who was now sitting at the table with a legal pad and a focused expression that suggested the skepticism had undergone a significant update. The third was a young specialist named Harper, who was 22 years old and 8 months out of her first deployment, and who had, according to everything Webb knew about her, idolized Commander Cross, with the particular intensity that young soldiers sometimes develop for the people who represented what they wanted to become. Harper was not looking at Cross, she was looking at Claire, with the particular quality of attention that meant she had found something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. Webb set down the documentation. He looked at the room, at the 6 people around the table, at the 3 whiteboards covered in Cross's handwriting and Claire's tighter notations and Reyes's color-coded connective lines. He pulled up a chair. "What did I miss?" he said. 12 hours, Reyes said without looking up. "Summarize." "Well, we're redefining what this program trains for," Kowalski said. "Instead of optimizing for speed and accuracy under known stress conditions, we're building a curriculum that teaches soldiers to operate in conditions where the variables exceed their training. The gap between the last thing training covered and the first thing combat requires," Webb said. "Exactly that," Claire said. Webb looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a long time," he said. "Since Black Horizons," she said. It was the first time she had said those words in a room with more than one other person. The room noticed. Nobody reacted visibly, but the quality of the air changed in the way it changes when something that has been unnamed finally receives its name. "The scenarios you went through on that operation," Webb said carefully, "the decision points, they're the model for what we're building." "Not the specifics," she said. "I can't give you the specifics." "The architecture," he said, "the shape of the decision. Not what was decided, but what the decision required of the person making it." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. Webb nodded once. He picked up a marker and walked to the third whiteboard, which had the least writing on it. "Walk me through the architecture," he said. And Claire Mitchell, who had spent 8 days on this base being watched and evaluated and doubted and tested and quietly, steadily refusing to defend herself against any of it, Claire Mitchell stood up, walked to the whiteboard, and began to teach. Not the shot, not the classified mission, not the 6 names she carried every day in the part of herself that was still standing on the last night of Black Horizon, making a choice that cost everything and left her as the only receipt. She taught the architecture of the moment, the specific structure of what the human mind required in order to make a decision when all the options were unacceptable and time had run out and the training had reached its edge, and the only thing left was the person you actually were underneath everything you had been taught to perform. She taught it for 3 hours. And when she stopped, the whiteboard was full and the 6 people in the room were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have received something they are going to spend a long time absorbing. Harper, who was 22 years old and 8 months out of her first deployment, was the first one to speak. "Is this what you teach yourself?" she asked. "Every day, is this how you get up and do it again?" The room held its breath. Claire looked at her. "Every day," she said. "Every single day." Harper nodded. She wrote something on her own legal pad. Webb looked at what she wrote and then looked away because it was private and because it was exactly right and because some things that are exactly right deserve to stay in the moment they were created in. Outside the window, Coronado was moving through another afternoon in the way it always moved, loud and purposeful, and organized around the perpetual business of preparing people for the worst things the world could ask of them. Inside the room, something was being built that would outlast all of it. Not a curriculum, not a program, a different understanding of what the word capable meant. And at the center of it, holding a marker she had borrowed from Webb, standing in front of a whiteboard that was running out of space, was a woman who had come back from a place where the word impossible had been redefined and was quietly, steadily building something worth coming back for. The curriculum proposal landed on Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks' desk on a Thursday morning, 41 pages single-spaced with Cross's signature on the cover page, and 5 names listed as contributing designers underneath it. Claire's name was second. Hendricks read the entire document before she made a single phone call. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, slowly, with a pen in her hand, making notations in the margins that were sometimes questions and sometimes agreements and sometimes just a single word that meant she needed to think about that section longer before she decided what she believed about it. She finished reading at 11:47. She sat with it for 13 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called Cross. He answered on the first ring. "You read it," he said, not a question. "I read it," she said. And I want to know," she said carefully, "how much of this came from her." Cross paused. "Define came from. The framework, the decision architecture, the specific methodology for designing scenarios without pre-approved outcomes." She tapped her pen against the margin notation she had made on page 17. "That's not language that comes from 30 years of training design. That's language that comes from somewhere else. It comes from experience," Cross said. "Her experience." "Yes." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "She gave you Black Horizon." "She gave me the architecture," Cross said. "Not the specifics. She was very clear about the boundary. What she gave me was the shape of what the decision required, not what the decision was." "There's a difference," Hendricks said. "There's an enormous difference," Cross said. "And she held that line without me having to ask her to. She knew exactly where the boundary was, and she worked right up to the edge of it without crossing it, every time." He paused. "That's not something I asked her to do. That's just who she is." Hendricks made another notation. "Cross," she said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "There are people in the Washington who are going to look at this proposal and see her name on it and have a reaction." "What kind of reaction?" "The kind that has nothing to do with the quality of the work," Hendricks said. "The kind that has everything to do with what her name represents to certain people in certain offices who have been watching what you do at Coronado for a long time, and who have very specific ideas about what a special operations training program should look like, and who should be designing it." Cross's voice went quiet, not softer, quieter. The specific quality of quiet that meant he was paying very careful attention. "Are you telling me there's going to be pushback?" he said. "I'm telling you there's already pushback," Hendricks said. "I'm telling you that before this document reached my desk, 3 people in the Oversight Division had already flagged her name in connection with the redesign. Not the work, her name." "On what basis?" "On the basis," Hendricks said, "that a person with 7 classified pages in their record designing a new training curriculum for naval special warfare raises questions about information security that certain people consider worth raising." The line was quiet. "That's not what this is about," Cross said. "We'll follow on." "No," Hendricks agreed. "It's not." "Then what is it about, Bob?" "It's about the fact that she's here," Hendricks said, "and she's visible. And visible is complicated for people who preferred that she remain the person in the classified file that nobody could read." Cross stood up from his desk. He didn't pace. He just stood the way he stood when something had made him too energized to remain seated, but too controlled to move without purpose. "Who specifically?" he said. "I'm not going to give you names right now," Hendricks said. "What I'm going to give you is a warning. The proposal is going to be reviewed. The review is going to take longer than it should, and during that review, someone is going to contact you directly and suggest that the curriculum redesign proceed without certain contributors. Without Claire. Without Captain Mitchell," Hendricks said, a long pause. "Sarah T. Cross said. He almost never used her first name. She noticed it every time he did. I will pull the entire proposal before I remove her name from it." "I know," Hendricks said. "I was counting on that." He stopped. "You're not warning me so I can prepare a compromise." "I'm warning you," she said, "so you can prepare a defense. There's a difference, and I need you to understand the difference before the call comes, because when it comes, it's going to sound very reasonable and very procedural and very much like something that has nothing to do with her specifically, and I need you to be ready to see through that." Cross was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he said. "The call 3 days, maybe 4. "And if I defend the proposal as submitted, then we fight," Hendricks said simply. "And we probably win, but it's going to be a fight." She hung up. Cross stood at his desk for a moment longer. Then he walked to Claire's office, a small utilitarian space she had occupied for less than 2 weeks, but that already had the particular organized quality of someone who arranged their environment to reflect the way their mind worked, rather than the way military protocol suggested spaces should be organized, and knocked on the open door. She looked up. "We have a problem," he said. She set down her pen. "Tell me." He told her. He told her cleanly and directly, and without the softening language that he might have used with someone he thought needed protecting, because he had learned in 2 weeks that Claire Mitchell did not need protecting. She needed accurate information delivered honestly so she could decide what to do with it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My name," she said. "Yes." "Not the work." "The work is excellent," he said. "The work is the best thing that's come out of this office in 11 years, and I will say that to anyone in any room, at any clearance level who wants to discuss it. But my name on the work," she said, "is a flag." "To certain people," Cross said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Do you want me to take my name off it?" "No," he said immediately. "Cross." She held his gaze. "If removing my name gets the work implemented, that's a trade worth making." "It's not a trade I'm willing to make," he said. "The work is what matters." "The work matters," he said. "And the fact that you did the work matters. They're not separable. Removing your name doesn't just change the document. It changes what the document says about what's possible. And changing what's possible for the next person who walks through that gate carrying a classified record and 6 people they're trying to justify, that's the whole point." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Reyes was standing in the corridor outside Claire's office, not quite close enough to have heard what was said, but close enough to see Claire's face when Cross said the last sentence. And Reyes saw it. She told Webb about it later in the equipment room, trying to find the right words for what she had seen in Claire's expression in that moment. It was like, Reyes said and then stopped, like someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and someone else just put their hand under the weight. They're still carrying it, but they're not carrying it alone. Webb was quiet for a moment. "Did she say anything?" he said. "She said, 'Then we fight.'" Webb nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "she would." The call from Washington came on the second day, not the third. Earlier than Hendricks predicted, which told Cross that the people making it were more concerned than they wanted to appear. The voice on the line was professional, courteous, and exactly as reasonable sounding as Hendricks had warned him it would be. A deputy director of oversight named Calloway, who Cross had spoken to twice before in professional contexts and who had both times struck him as a person whose primary skill was making consequential decisions and sound administrative. "Commander Cross," Calloway said, "I've had the opportunity to review the preliminary proposal from your office. Impressive work." "Thank you," Cross said. He kept his voice exactly neutral. "The decision architecture framework is particularly interesting, novel approach. The team you assembled did strong work." "They did." "I do want to discuss one element," Calloway said, "purely as a procedural matter." "Of course," Cross said. "The involvement of personnel with active security classifications at the design level of a new training curriculum raises some flags from an information compartmentalization standpoint. Not a reflection of capability, please understand, that purely a question of protocol." Cross said nothing. "In cases where contributors have classified operational history," Calloway continued, "standard practice is to limit their design role to consultation rather than primary authorship. Again, purely procedural. The distinction on the cover page. The distinction on the cover page," Cross said, "reflects the actual contribution each person made to the document." A brief pause. "I understand," Calloway said, "and I'm not suggesting that contribution was anything other than legitimate, but given the sensitivity," Deputy Director Calloway, Cross said, "Captain Mitchell's name is on that document because she built the central framework that makes it worth submitting. Removing her name would be factually inaccurate, and I don't submit factually inaccurate documents." Another pause, longer this time. "I see," Calloway said. "The proposal stands as submitted," Cross said. "If there are specific security concerns about specific content, I am willing to address those concerns through the appropriate review process. But I won't make personnel changes to a cover page based on the optics of someone's service history." The line was quiet. "Commander Cross," Calloway said finally, and his voice had shifted slightly. Still professional, still courteous, but carrying something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Something that was not quite a warning, something more like a recalibration. "I appreciate your position. We'll proceed with the full review." He hung up. Cross set down the phone. He sat at his desk for a moment, Then he picked the phone back up and called Hendricks. It happened today, he said when she answered. What did you do? I told him the proposal stands as submitted. A pause. How did he take it? He said they'd proceed with the full review. Good, Hendricks said. That means we won round one. She paused. Cross. What? Does she know this call happened? Not yet. Tell her, Hendricks said. Tell her today. Don't let her find out from someone else. She has a right to know that someone fought for her name on a piece of paper. I know, Cross said. And Cross, when you tell her, make sure she understands it wasn't just the work. Make sure she understands that. He understood what Hendricks was saying. He found Claire at the range at 1500 hours, exactly where he expected her to be, exactly as he had found her 2 weeks ago, sitting with her notebook, working through something unhurried and focused. This time when he sat down, he was 12 feet away for only a moment before he moved to the bench directly beside her. She noticed. She didn't comment. The call came this morning, he said. She set down her pen. Calloway, he said, Deputy Director of Oversight. He suggested the cover page needed adjustment. She looked at him. I told him the proposal stands as submitted. She was very still. He pushed back. He used the phrase purely procedural 3 times, Cross said, which in my experience means the opposite. What did you say? I told him removing your name would be factually inaccurate. She held his gaze for a long moment. Cross, she said. It's true, he said simply. It's a factually accurate document. That's where it starts and ends for me. It's not where it starts and ends for them, she said. No, he agreed, but it's where it starts and ends for me. And this is my facility. She was quiet. I need you to understand something, he said, about why I'm not moving on this. You don't have to explain. I do, he said, because I owe you an explanation. I challenged you in front of 200 people based on assumptions I hadn't examined. I used the weight of this institution against you before you had any standing to push back. And when you answered that challenge, not just with the shot, but with everything after it, I started trying to do the work of correcting that. But this is where the correction actually matters. She was looking at him with the particular attention she gave things she was absorbing fully. If I allow your name to be removed from that document, he said, I am doing the same thing to you that I did on the range. I am saying that what you contributed is real, but your right to be publicly connected to it is negotiable based on other people's comfort. And that is not something I am able to do. The range was very quiet. Claire looked down at her notebook for a moment. Then she looked back up. 6 names, she said. He waited. Torres, Breckenridge, Okafor, Park, Vasquez, Kim. She said them quietly, one at a time, with the precision of someone who had said them so many times in private that they had become part of the rhythm of her breathing. Every day since I came back, I have been trying to build something that justifies the cost of those 6 lives. Not to replace them, you can't replace them, but to make the space they left into something that produces more than grief. She picked up her pen, set it back down. If that curriculum gets implemented, she said, if the methodology we built becomes the standard for how this institution trains decision-making, then the framework that Torres would have contributed and Breckenridge would have refined and Okafor would have challenged and Park would have argued about over very good coffee, that framework exists in the world. Not as a tribute, as a function, as something that keeps working after the people who built it are gone. Her voice stayed level. Every word of it. That's why my name on the document matters, she said. Not because I need the credit, but because the document with my name on it says that a person who survived Black Horizon built something with what they survived. And that means the surviving was worth something. And that means she stopped. She pressed her lips together for one moment, one single controlled moment. That means they didn't die, so I could stand quietly in the corner and let other people decide whether my name belongs on the things I build. Cross didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would be larger than what she had just said. He nodded once. She picked up her pen. He stood up. He was almost at the door when she said, without looking up, Cross. He stopped. Thank you, she said. He walked out. And he stood outside the range in the afternoon air, and he understood with the full weight of 61 years of experience, pressing down on the understanding that he was watching someone do the hardest thing a human being could do. Not the shot, not the classified mission, not the decision that cost 6 lives and left her as the only receipt, The hardest thing, the thing that took longer than any operation and required more discipline than any training, and produced no visible result for a very long time. She was choosing every single day to build forward. In the 41 pages sitting on Hendrix's desk, in the whiteboard covered in framework and architecture in the shape of decisions that had no correct answer. In the name on the cover page that she was not going to remove. She was choosing to build forward. And Cross, who had spent 3 decades teaching people how to be exceptional, was standing outside a range at Coronado, California, understanding for the first time in his career what exceptional actually required. It required this. The decision to keep building in the direction of something that mattered, even when the cost of building was higher than most people would accept. Every day, without stopping. Without the guarantee of recognition or vindication or the comfortable certainty that the work would survive the politics surrounding it. Just the decision. Repeated. For as long as it took. The full review took 11 days. 11 days during which the base continued its normal operations with the particular quality of organized forward motion that military facilities maintain, regardless of what is happening in the administrative and political layers above the room. Years above the daily work, training ran, qualifications proceeded, the mess hall filled and emptied on its regular schedule. But underneath the normal operations, something else was running. The conversation that had started on the range 2 weeks ago had not stopped. It had changed form. It had moved from the initial shock of what they witnessed into the slower, more durable process of people genuinely reconsidering things they had thought they knew. Webb started running an additional 30 minutes at the end of his morning PT, not because his physical conditioning required it, but because he had started using the time to think through scenarios from the curriculum draft, and he found that he thought better when his body was occupied. Kowalski pulled out his shooting logs from the past 3 years and went through them with a specificity he hadn't applied before looking for the pattern. Claire had described the moments where uncertainty had affected his performance in ways he had previously attributed to external variables. He found 12 of them, 12 specific instances in 3 years, where he could now identify in retrospect that the problem hadn't been the wind or the distance or the timing. The problem had been the space between his last moment of certainty and the moment when he had to act anyway. He documented them. He brought the documentation to Claire on the 8th day of the review period. She read through it with the careful attention she gave everything, and when she finished reading, she said, "This is the most honest self-assessment I have seen from an operator with 11 years of experience." Kowalski looked at her. "Is that good?" "It's rare," she said. "Most people can't look at their own performance record and find the moments where the problem was internal rather than external. It's easier to attribute failures to conditions." "It felt important to be accurate," he said. "It is accurate," she said, "which is why it's rare." She handed back the documentation. "Can I use this," she said, anonymized, "as a case study in the curriculum?" He thought about it for a moment. "Use my name," he said. She looked at him. "If the point is that honest self-assessment is possible," he said, "then doing it anonymously kind of defeats the purpose." She held his gaze. "Kowalski," she said, "yeah. 2 weeks ago, you were telling people in the mess hall that a classified record was the military's way of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves in public scrutiny." He had the grace to look directly uncomfortable. "I know. Now you want your name on a case study in my curriculum." "Your curriculum," he said, "with your name on the cover." Something moved across her face, brief, real. "Okay," she said. "Your name stays." He nodded. He started to leave. "Kowalski." He stopped. "Park made very good coffee," she said. He turned back. She was looking at her notebook, not at him. But her voice had that quality again, the one Reyes had described. The sound of someone carrying something that was very heavy and choosing deliberately to carry it forward rather than down. "I don't know why I'm telling you that," she said. "I just think some of them should be real to the people who are building what we're building." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Torres," she said quietly. He laughed at everything. Kowalski nodded slowly. "I'll make good coffee tomorrow," he said, "for the work session." She looked up. "Park would have approved," she said. He left, and in the corridor out of sight of her office, he stopped and put one hand against the wall and stood there for a moment because what she had just given him, the small, human-specific reality of 6 people he would never meet, had landed somewhere in his chest with a weight that surprised him. Not grief, not exactly. Something more like responsibility. The answer from the oversight division came on the 11th day. Hendricks called Cross at 0800. The proposal is approved, she said. Cross was quiet for 1 second. As submitted, he said. As submitted, Hendricks said. Cover page, contributing designers, framework, methodology, all of it. Full implementation authorization for the next training cycle. What changed their minds, he said. Three things, Hendricks said. One, the quality of the work was genuinely difficult to argue with, even for people who were looking for a reason to argue with it. Two, your refusal to negotiate on the cover page created a paper trail that made the political nature of their objection more visible than they were comfortable with. And three, Hendricks paused. Someone sent Calloway an anonymized summary of what happened on the range, she said. The challenge, the shot, the 45 seconds, the things she said afterward. Cross was very still. Who sent it? I did, Hendricks said. Silence. Sarah. He needed to understand what he was objecting to, she said. Not the classified history, not the politics. What he was objecting to was a person who had done something remarkable and was trying to build something lasting from it. And once he understood that once it was a person rather than a flag on a cover page, the calculation changed. Cross sat down. Does she know you did that? He said. Not yet, Hendricks said. I'll leave it to your judgment whether she needs to. I thought about it. She needs to know, he said. She has a right to know who saw her and chose to use what they saw to defend her. Agreed, Hendricks said. She hung up. Cross sat at his desk for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone and sent a single message to the group that had been working on the curriculum, Claire, Rickus, Kowalski, Webb, Tran, Ferrero, Harper. The message said, proposal approved, full implementation, as submitted. He watched the replies come in. Reyes, I knew it. Kowalski, about time. Webb, good. Tran, ready to build. Ferrero, let's go. Harper, yes. He watched the screen for Claire's response. It came 90 seconds after the others. It said for Torres, Breckenridge, Okafor, Park, Vasquez, Kim. Cross set down the phone. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and walked out of his office. He had a program to launch. And for the first time in 30 years, he was going to launch it with the absolute certainty that what he was building was exactly what it needed to be. Not because he had designed it perfectly, but because the person who had taught him what perfect required was walking through the base right now with a notebook in her hand and 6 names in her chest and the quiet, unbreakable intention of making every single day worth the cost of being the one who came back. He walked faster. There was work to do. The first class under the new curriculum began on a Monday morning at 0600, and the 43 soldiers who filed into the briefing room at Coronado found something they had not expected. No Commander Cross at the front of the room. No PowerPoint presentation running on the screen. No administrative paperwork on the tables. Just Captain Claire Mitchell standing at the front of the room with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched yet and a single sentence written on the whiteboard behind her. The sentence said, what do you do when the training runs out? Runs out, nobody sat down immediately. They stood in the doorway and read the sentence and felt a particular quality of unease that comes from walking into a room where the rules are different from the rules you prepared for. A soldier named First Lieutenant Graves, 28 years old. 3 deployments, the kind of physical confidence that comes from years of being the strongest person in most rooms. He walked into, looked at the sentence, and then looked at Claire and said, is this the decision-making program? Sit down and find out, she said. He sat down. They all sat down. Claire let the silence run for exactly 10 seconds after the last person took their seat. Not a performance of authority, an actual pause, the kind that told the room that what was about to happen operated on a different clock than what they were used to. Then she said, everyone in this room has training. Most of you have significant training. Some of you have more hours of specialized preparation than most people in this country will accumulate in an entire career. And every single piece of that training is built on a foundation that has a specific limitation. I want you to understand that limitation before we go any further, because everything we do in this room for the next 12 weeks is designed around it. Nobody moved. The limitation, she said, is that training has an edge. There is a point, a specific identifiable point, where the scenarios your preparation covered end and reality begins. And at that point, the training stops being a resource and starts being a weight. Because your mind keeps reaching for the answer it was trained to find, and the answer isn't there. And the gap between reaching and finding is where people freeze. She picked up her coffee. This program, she said, is about the gap. Graves leaned forward. How do you train for something that, by definition, exceeds your training? Good question, she said. First question of the program, you don't train for the scenarios beyond the edge. You train the mind that has to operate when the scenarios run out. What does that look like? Said a soldier in the second row. A woman named Specialist Chen, 24 years old, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who asked questions because she genuinely wanted to know the answers rather than to demonstrate that she was paying attention. It looks like what we're going to do this morning, Claire said, which is nothing you have done before. She set down her coffee and walked to the door at the back of the room. She opened it. Outside the door in the corridor were Webb, Kowalski, Reyes, Tronferrero, and Harper, the full team that had built the curriculum with her, standing in a line with the particular quality of people who knew what was about to happen and had prepared for it. On your feet, Claire said to the class. They stood. Follow them, she said, gesturing to the team in the corridor. You have 90 seconds before the first scenario begins. I suggest you use the time to accept that you don't know what's coming. The class looked at each other, then they moved. What followed was 3 hours that would be described differently by every single person who went through them. Because the nature of what Claire had designed was that each person's experience of it was specific to the particular architecture of their own mind, the specific ways they responded to uncertainty, the specific reflexes they had built over years of training, the specific moment where each of them hit their personal edge and discovered what lived on the other side of it. Webb ran the first scenario. He wouldn't describe it afterward in specifics because the specifics were classified to the curriculum, but the shape of it was this: a decision point with no correct answer, a time limit that was slightly shorter than comfortable, and a consequence structure that made the cost of every available option visible before the decision was made. Not hidden costs, visible ones. That was the specific design that Claire had insisted on, and it was the thing that made the first scenario unlike anything the class had experienced in previous training. Because previous training hid the costs until after the decision, this training showed you the costs first and asked you to choose anyway. Graves froze on the first decision point. Not for long. 4 seconds. But Webb was watching his face, and Kowalski was watching his hands, and the 4-second freeze was visible to everyone in the team who had been trained specifically to watch for it. When the scenario ended, Webb said to him quietly, "What happened at the decision point?" Graves looked at him. "I was looking for the option with the lowest cost. And Wemmon, there wasn't one. So what did you do?" "I froze," Graves said, like admitting it out loud was a different kind of physical act than experiencing it. "For 4 seconds I froze because my mind wouldn't accept that all the options had unacceptable costs." Webb nodded. "That's the edge," he said. "That's the moment the training runs out. What you do in the next 4 seconds after you recognize you're frozen, that's what we're here to work on." Graves looked at him. "Can you actually train that?" he said. "We're going to find out together," Webb said. 3 hours in, when Claire called the class back to the briefing room for assessment, the room had a completely different quality from the one it had when they left it. The physical confidence that most of them carried, the solid trained certainty of people who had spent years becoming very good at very hard things, had developed a new texture. Not diminished, complicated, layered with the specific kind of self-awareness that comes from encountering your own limitation in real time and recognizing it for what it is. Chen was the first one to speak during the assessment session. "I want to understand the 45 seconds, she said. The room went still. Not all of them knew the story. Some of them did. It had traveled through the base in the way that true things travel slower than rumors, but further, arriving with more weight when it landed. But not all of them. Claire looked at Chen. "What do you know about the 45 seconds, she said. "Enough," Chen said. "I know that before you made the shot that Cross designed to be impossible, you stood still for 45 seconds. And I know that what happened in those 45 seconds was the actual skill. The shot was just what came after." She paused. "I think that's what you're trying to teach us. I just don't understand yet how you teach a person to use 45 seconds the way you use them." The room was very quiet. Claire looked at the class at 43 people who had just spent 3 hours discovering the specific shape of their own edges, and she made a decision. She had made this decision before actually. She had made it in the abstract, in the privacy of her own preparation for this moment. She had decided that there was a version of what happened on Black Horizon that she could give to these people. Not the specifics, not the classified architecture, but the truth of what the experience had built in her, told honestly enough that it could be useful to them. She had rehearsed it 3 times. She had deleted it twice. She had kept it the 3rd time because Reyes had read it and said, give them this. They need this version of it. Before Operation Black Horizon, she said, I thought I understood pressure. I had been through training that was designed to simulate the worst conditions I would face in the field. I was good under that pressure. I was consistently good. I trusted my training, and my training consistently delivered. The room was listening with the kind of attention that has no fidgeting in it. The operation moved past the edge of my training on the 2nd day, she said. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way it happens in reality, which is incrementally one variable at a time, the situation compounding on itself until you look up and realize the environment you're operating in has no relationship to anything you prepared for. She paused. There was a decision point, she said. I won't tell you what the decision was. I will tell you what it required. It required me to accept in approximately 4 seconds that every option in front of me had a cost that was unacceptable. And then choose anyway. Graves was leaning forward. How he said, it came out quieter than he intended. I stopped looking for the option that wasn't there, she said. That's all. I stopped spending processing power on the search for the answer my training had taught me to find, and I redirected that processing power to the actual question, which was not which option was correct, but which option I could live with. She let that land. Which option you could live with, Chen said slowly. Not the option with the lowest cost, Claire said. The option whose cost you could carry, because you're going to carry it. Whatever you choose, you carry the cost of it for the rest of your life. So the real question at the decision point is not tactical. It's personal. It's about knowing yourself well enough to know which weight you can bear and still keep moving. The room was completely silent. Graves sat back in his chair. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him. That's what the 45 seconds was, he said. Not a question, a recognition. You were figuring out which weight you could carry. I was remembering which weights I was already carrying, she said, and deciding they weren't heavy enough to stop me. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Harper, 22 years old, 8 months out of her first deployment, the person who had been watching Claire instead of Cross since the moment the curriculum team assembled, raised her hand. Claire looked at her. The people you are carrying, Harper said. She said it carefully, like she had understood she was touching something that needed to be touched with precision. The ones from Black Horizon, do they get lighter over time? The room held its breath. Claire looked at Harper for a long moment. No, she said. Harper nodded. But you get stronger, Claire said. Not because the weight decreases, because you choose every day to build the muscles that carrying it requires. And eventually the weight that was going to destroy you becomes the thing that makes you capable of something you couldn't have been without it. Harper wrote something in her notebook. The soldier next to her tried to read it and couldn't quite, but later Harper would tell Reyes what she wrote, and Reyes would carry it for the rest of her career. Harper wrote, the weight is the training. The first week of the program was the hardest week most of the class had experienced outside of actual deployment. Not physically. Physically, it was demanding but manageable, the same Coronado demanding that everyone had adapted to. Psychologically, it was something else. Because what Claire had designed and what the whole team had built across those 72 hours of work on the whiteboards was a curriculum that systematically and deliberately brought each person in the class to their own personal edge and then asked them to stay there, not to cross it, not to be pushed past it, to stay at the edge, to learn the feel of it, to become familiar with the specific quality of the moment when training runs out and the person remains. That was the skill, not the decision. The ability to remain functional at the exact moment when your training stops being a resource. Graves called it the scariest thing he had ever been asked to do voluntarily. Chen called it the most honest training she had ever received. A soldier named Morrison, who had been quiet through most of the first week and who the team had been watching with the careful attention they gave to people who process things deeply, rather than quickly came to Claire on the fifth day at end of training and said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "After Black Horizon," he said. "After you came back. Did you ever think about stopping?" She looked at him steadily. "Stopping what?" "All of it," he said. "The work, the service, carrying what you carry." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. He nodded, like the honesty of it was something he needed physically. "What stopped you from stopping?" But he said. "The same thing that stopped me from freezing at the decision point," she said. "I asked myself which weight I could carry, and I decided I could carry forward better than I could carry done." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "I lost someone on my last deployment," he said. "Not the way you lost, not the same scale, one person. But," he stopped. "But it's yours," she said. "It's mine," he said. "The weight is always proportional to the person," she said, "not to the number. One person who mattered is not a smaller loss than 6 people. It's a different shape of the same weight." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I've had both," she said quietly. "And the arithmetic doesn't work the way people think it does." He stood there for a moment longer. "Morrison," she said. "Yes." "Keep coming back tomorrow," she said. "That's all. Just keep coming back." He nodded. He left. And Claire stood in the empty training room for a moment alone, and she did something she rarely allowed herself to do in professional spaces. She thought about Park. Just for a moment, just the specific memory of him standing at the field equipment station on the second morning of Black Horizon, making coffee with the particular focused attention he gave it, like the quality of the coffee was a moral statement, like getting it right in those conditions was its own form of resistance against everything that was trying to go wrong. She thought about him for exactly as long as she could afford to think about him in a place where she needed to remain functional. Then she picked up her notebook and walked out. The first graduation ceremony for the new program happened 6 weeks later. Not at the end of the 12-week curriculum. They ran a midpoint assessment the way Cross had insisted because he wanted data on how the framework was landing before the full cycle completed. He wanted to know if what they had built was doing what they had designed it to do. The midpoint numbers were the kind of numbers that made Hendricks quiet on the phone for a long moment before she said anything. Decision coherence under cascading variables up 41% from baseline. Post-freeze recovery time reduced by an average of 63%. Self-assessed confidence in novel scenarios with no pre-approved solution up 58%. "Those numbers," Hendricks said. "I know," Cross said. "Those numbers are not what I expected in 6 weeks." "Neither did I," Cross said. "What changed?" she said. "I mean specifically. What is she doing in that room that produces those numbers in 6 weeks?" Cross thought about it. "She shows them the edge," he said. "Not theoretically. She takes them there, and then she stays with them at the edge. She doesn't pull them back, and she doesn't push them over. She just stands there with them in the hardest moment and makes it survivable by surviving it herself in real time in front of them." Hendricks was quiet. "She's using her own experience as the demonstration," she said. "Every day," Cross said. "Not the classified parts, but the truth of what it requires to function in the gap between training and reality. She gives them that. She gives them the real version of it, not the sanitized version, not the version designed to make it feel achievable before they try it. And they trust her because of it," Hendricks said. "They trust her," Cross said, "because she doesn't ask them to go anywhere she hasn't been. And they know she's been there, not because of the classified record, because of the way she stands in the room with them." The midpoint ceremony was Cross's idea. Claire hadn't expected it. She came into the briefing room on the morning he had marked as midpoint assessment and found the room set up differently than usual. Chairs arranged in a configuration that wasn't standard for an evaluation session. The whole curriculum team present in the class already seated and looking at her with an expression she didn't immediately categorize. Cross was standing at the front of the room. "Captain Mitchell," he said. She stopped in the doorway. "Come in," he said. She came in. 6 weeks ago," Cross said, addressing the class but looking at her, "this program didn't exist. The framework didn't exist. The methodology didn't exist. What existed was a 30-year-old curriculum that was good, genuinely good, and a gap that nobody had named yet." The class was very still. "The gap has a name now," Cross said, "and it has a framework. And the numbers from your midpoint evaluations tell me that the framework is working in ways that exceed what I projected when we submitted the proposal. He paused. What I want you to understand, he said, is where the framework came from, not abstractly, specifically. It came from a person who went to the edge of what training could prepare her for, made a decision that cost everything, came back and spent the years since her return, building something out of what the experience taught her. He looked at Claire directly. Captain Mitchell designed the core framework of this program, he said, not as a subject of study, not as a case file, as a designer, as a teacher. And what she built, what she's been delivering to you for 6 weeks every morning in this room is the most significant advancement in decision-making curriculum that this institution has seen in my tenure. The room was very quiet. I challenged her, Cross said when she arrived at this base. I did it publicly, and I did it under the assumption that what I didn't know about her was more likely to be a liability than an asset. He stopped. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that I have spent the past 6 weeks trying to be useful enough to justify. He turned to the class. What Captain Mitchell gave you in those 6 weeks is not transferable by summary. He said, you can't paraphrase what happened in that room to someone who wasn't there and have them receive the same thing you received. The thing she gave you lives in the specific experience of standing at your own edge with someone who has stood at a more extreme version of that edge and chosen it every day to build forward rather than stop. He stepped back. Stand up, please, he said to Claire. She stood. She was looking at him with the careful, steady attention she gave things she was still processing. The class stood. All 43 of them, not prompted, not instructed. They just stood. And then Graves, who had frozen for 4 seconds at the first decision point 6 weeks ago, and who had in the week since become one of the most remarkable participants in the program, started to clap. Not the polite, measured applause of a formal ceremony, the real kind. The kind that carries weight. It moved through the room like something physical. Claire stood at the front of the class and received it with the same stillness she brought to everything, not performing. Humility, not performing gratitude, not performing anything at all. Just standing. The way she had stood at the range on the first morning. The way she stood every day in front of 43 people at the edge of what they knew about themselves. Completely present. Carrying what she carried. Building forward. When the applause stopped, she said one thing. Torres would have made a joke right now, she said. It would have been perfectly timed and completely inappropriate, and everyone in the room would have laughed. I want you to know that. She paused. I want you to know that the people whose absence made this program possible were not symbols. They were specific. They were loud and quiet and funny and serious and very good at what they did, and they deserved to be here. The room was very still. They're not here, she said, so we have to be here for them, and that's what this program is. That's what every decision you make at the edge of your training is. It's the answer to the question of what you do with the life that costs someone else theirs. She picked up her notebook. Same time tomorrow, she said. The ceremony, such as it was, ended. People began to move. But Cross stood at the front of the room for a moment longer, watching the class file out, watching the curriculum team gather their materials, watching Claire accept a quiet word from Reyes and respond with something that made Reyes nod, and then look at the floor for a moment in the way people look at the floor when something has landed in them that they need a second to absorb. He thought about the yellow legal pad in his desk drawer, the list of ways he had been wrong. He had not added to it since the day he wrote it, not because he had stopped being wrong about things, because the list had served its purpose. He had looked at what he got wrong and he had let it change him, and he had done the only thing that made getting it wrong worth anything. He had built forward. The full 12-week cycle completed on a Thursday. The graduation ceremony was a real one, official, attended by Hendricks in person with documentation and recognition that would go into the personnel files of every soldier who completed the program. Claire stood at the front of the room for the last time as the primary instructor of the first cohort, and she looked at 43 people who had walked into a briefing room 6 weeks ago, carrying everything their training had built, and had spent 12 weeks learning what lived on the other side of it. Hendricks spoke first because rank required it. She talked about the numbers, the performance data, the specifics of what the midpoint and final evaluation showed. She talked about the proposal and the review process and the decision to approve the curriculum and what it meant for the institution going forward. She was thorough and precise and appropriately formal. And then she said something that was not in any prepared remarks, that she said looking directly at Claire with the directness of someone who had made a decision about what needed to be said out loud, regardless of what the occasion called for. There were people who did not want this program to exist, Hendricks said, not because of the work, because of who built it. There were people who believed that the value of what Captain Mitchell contributed was real, but that her visibility and connection to it was a complication worth managing. The room was very quiet. They were wrong, Hendricks said, and the numbers in front of me tell me they were wrong with a specificity that I intend to make visible to everyone in the oversight division who made that argument. She paused. The lesson of this program, she said, is not about decision-making architecture. The lesson of this program is that the person you underestimate is sometimes the person who teaches you what excellence requires. And excellence requires that we stop accepting the conditions under which some people have to prove themselves twice as clearly to be seen half as well. She looked at the class. You went through 12 weeks of the hardest psychological training this institution offers, she said. You are better operators because of it. Remember where it came from. She stepped back, cross-stepped forward. He had prepared remarks. He didn't use them. He looked at the class for a moment, and then he looked at Claire, and then he said the thing that had been forming in him since the morning on the range, when she made the shot and said the truest thing anyone had said to him in 30 years. I spent 3 decades believing that I understood what it meant to be exceptional, he said. I was right about the technical definition. I was wrong about the human one. He paused. The greatest mistake I made in my career was standing in front of 200 people and demanding that a soldier prove herself to me before I was willing to see her. He stopped. The greatest thing that happened in my career was that she did it anyway, not for me. For reasons that were larger than my skepticism and older than my authority and more important than my opinion of her. He looked at the class. Take that with you, he said, into every room you walk into for the rest of your career. The person standing quietly in the corner has already fought the battle you're afraid to face. See them before you decide what they are. The ceremony ended. People move the way people move after formal things end toward each other, toward the exits, toward the ordinary human business of processing significant moments by talking about them with the people who shared them. Claire was standing near the back of the room when Harper found her. Harper stood in front of her without speaking for a moment. Then she said, I keep thinking about what you said, about the weight getting heavier, but you getting stronger. Yes, Claire said. I think I understand it now, Harper said. After 12 weeks, I think I understand it in my body, not just my head. Claire looked at her. What does it feel like, she said. Harper thought about it. Like I'm not afraid of the weight anymore, she said. I'm still afraid of a lot of things, but the weight itself, the weight of the decision, the weight of the cost, the weight of choosing when there's no correct answer, I'm not afraid of that anymore. I know I can carry it. Claire was quiet for a moment. Park would have made you excellent coffee on your graduation day, she said. Harper's eyes went a little bright. Tell me about him, she said. And Claire did. She stood in the back of a room at Naval Special Warfare Training Center Coronado while the graduation ceremony dissolved into ordinary human movement around them. And she told Harper about Park and the coffee and the way he treated it like a moral statement. She told her about Torres and the laugh that had the worst possible timing and was completely genuine every single time. She told her about Breckenridge, who was almost never wrong, and Okafor, who was 24 years old and already had a philosophy, and Vasquez with 3 kids, and Kim, who was 6 weeks from Seattle. She told her all of it, not the classified parts, the human parts, the parts that lived in her chest every day and made every shot and every decision and every 45 seconds of stillness mean something beyond the technical and the tactical and the institutional. And Harper listened with the complete unperformed attention of someone receiving something they understood was being trusted to them. When Claire finished, Harper said, I'll carry them too. Claire looked at her. I know, she said. And that was the moment, not the shot, not the approval, not the ceremony, not the numbers that vindicated the curriculum, not the applause or the recognition or the acknowledgement from Cross and Hendricks that what she had built was real and lasting and worth the cost of fighting for it. That was the moment, a 22-year-old soldier saying, I'll carry them too. 6 names passing from the person who had been carrying them alone into the shared weight of someone who understood what it meant to carry forward rather than down. That was the reason, not the shot. The work outliving the people who made it possible. The weight becoming the training. The silence at the edge of everything you know, becoming the place where you finally discover what you are. Captain Claire Mitchell walked out of the briefing room at Coronado on a Thursday afternoon, carrying 6 names in the knowledge that they were no longer hers alone to carry. And the base that had spent its first 5 days deciding what she was went on producing exceptional soldiers who would spend the rest of their careers understanding in their bodies, not just their minds. That true ability does not announce itself, that excellence has a human cost that must be honored rather than classified, and that the person who stands quietly at the edge of what is possible is sometimes the person who has already survived the distance everyone else is still afraid to travel. She had not come to Coronado to be believed. She had come to build something worth believing in, and she